Between 1942 and 1943, in a quiet corner of northeastern Poland, Treblinka became a factory of death. Trains arrived from ghettos and cities across Europe. Most who stepped onto the platform were dead within hours. This is the story of a camp built solely to kill, where deception, routine, and efficiency turned murder into procedure. The voices of those lost were smothered by ash, by deliberate erasure, and by a world too slow to face what happened there.
On April 17, 1942, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, signed the order establishing the Treblinka camp complex. The decision to build this facility in this particular location was not arbitrary. The isolated terrain, the sandy soil that could easily be excavated, and the proximity to major railway lines made it ideal for the Nazis' purposes. Most importantly, it was far enough from major population centers to maintain secrecy, yet close enough to the Warsaw Ghetto to facilitate the rapid deportation of hundreds of thousands of people. Responsibility for creating this infrastructure of death fell to Arpad Weigand, an SS officer who served as the SS and police leader for the Warsaw district. Weigand had already distinguished himself in the Nazi hierarchy through his role in implementing terror policies within the Warsaw Ghetto, where conditions of deliberate starvation and disease had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. Now he would oversee the construction of something even more efficient. The Treblinka complex consisted of two separate camps. Treblinka I, established first, functioned as a forced labor camp. Prisoners here were put to work constructing the infrastructure that would make mass murder possible. They quarried gravel, built roads, and erected the buildings and fences of the second facility. For those imprisoned in Treblinka I, the line between survival and selection for extermination was razor thin. At any moment, weakness, illness, or arbitrary decision could result in transfer to the second camp. Treblinka II, the extermination center, was designed with a single purpose. There were no factories here, no workshops, no pretense of productivity. This was a facility built solely to kill human beings as quickly and efficiently as possible.
The command structure of Treblinka reflected the Nazi state's ability to find individuals willing to participate in genocide. The first commandant of Treblinka I was Theodor von Eupen, an SS officer who managed the labor operations with characteristic brutality. But it was the leadership of Treblinka II that would become synonymous with industrial-scale murder. Dr. Irmfried Eberl, a physician by training, became the first commandant of the extermination camp. A medical professional who had participated in the Nazi euthanasia program, Eberl brought his experience in killing the disabled and mentally ill to this new assignment. Under his command, the camp began operations in July 1942. However, his tenure was brief. The killing proceeded so rapidly and chaotically under Eberl that even by Nazi standards, the operation was considered disorganized. Bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of, and the stench of death became noticeable for kilometers around the camp. In August 1942, Eberl was replaced by Franz Stangl, an Austrian police officer who had previously served as commandant of the Sobibor extermination camp. Stangl would prove to be far more effective at managing the machinery of death. Cold, efficient, and meticulously organized, he transformed Treblinka into what survivors would later describe as a factory, with arrival, processing, and disposal operating like an assembly line of annihilation. Stangl's deputy was Franz Kurt, who would later become the camp's third and final commandant. Kurt was known for his sadism, and his constant companion, a massive dog named Barry, a crossbreed of Saint Bernard and another large breed. This animal was trained to attack prisoners on command, and Kurt could unleash it on victims for his own amusement, particularly when intoxicated. Supporting this German command structure was a cadre of guards drawn from various sources. Ethnic Germans from Poland, known as Volksdeutsche, formed a significant portion of the camp's internal police force. Additionally, the SS recruited auxiliary guards from Soviet prisoners of war, primarily Ukrainians and others from occupied eastern territories. These men, facing starvation in POW camps, were given a choice between death and collaboration. Many chose survival, and in doing so, became complicit in crimes they would spend the rest of their lives trying to escape.
Perhaps the most psychologically complex element of Treblinka's operation was the system of Kapos. These were prisoners, primarily Jewish, who were forced into positions of authority over their fellow inmates. The Nazis understood that forcing victims to participate in their own destruction added an additional layer of psychological torment, while also reducing the number of German personnel required. The Kapos were divided into distinct groups. Some served as internal police, maintaining order among arriving prisoners and preventing panic. Others were assigned to the work details that operated the killing facilities, managing the disposal of bodies and maintaining the infrastructure of death. A select few were given authority to assist in sorting the possessions of the murdered. These men existed in an impossible position. Refusal meant immediate death. Compliance meant survival, but at the cost of participating in the murder of their own people. The Nazis deliberately selected individuals they judged to be psychologically vulnerable, those who might break under pressure. They would subject candidates to periods of extreme deprivation, starvation, and abuse. Then, when a prisoner was sufficiently weakened, they would offer improved conditions in exchange for cooperation. Some broke, some complied. The moral complexity of these situations resists simple judgment. These were not volunteers for evil, but people trapped in an impossible situation where every choice led to someone's death. Yet their presence served the Nazi purpose perfectly, creating a system where the victims themselves became part of the machinery of their own destruction.
The physical layout of Treblinka II was designed with cynical precision. A special railway spur was constructed from the main line to the camp itself. Near the entrance to the camp, the SS constructed an elaborate deception, a fake railway station, complete with a platform, a clock, and signs indicating connections to other cities. Flower boxes decorated the false station. The Germans wanted arriving prisoners to believe, for as long as possible, that they were simply being relocated. Transports arrived with as many as 50 freight cars, each packed with between 150 and 200 people. However, the camp's railway platform could only accommodate 20 cars at a time. Therefore, the killing proceeded in batches. 20 cars would be emptied, their passengers processed through the camp and killed. Then the next 20 would be brought forward. This continued until entire transports had been eliminated. The prisoners who arrived had often paid for their own tickets. In one of history's cruelest ironies, Jews being deported from cities across Europe were forced to purchase railway tickets for their journey to extermination. The Nazis told them they were being resettled to labor camps in the East, where Jewish communities would be established. Many traveled with their best possessions, believing they were starting a new life. Upon arrival, the deception continued. SS officers would announce that the arrivals had reached a transit camp, where they would be bathed and their clothing disinfected before continuing to their final destination. The prisoners were then separated. Men to one side, women and children to the other. The selection was swift and efficient. Within minutes of arrival, families that had traveled together were divided forever. Women and children were processed first. They were ordered to undress completely, told that their clothing needed to be disinfected. Naked and vulnerable, they were then herded down a narrow path, approximately 80 to 100 meters long, fenced on both sides with barbed wire. Prisoners called this path the tube. The Germans, in a display of their grotesque humor, referred to it as the road to heaven. Along this path stood SS guards and auxiliary police, holding dogs trained to attack anyone who resisted or fell behind. The women and children were driven forward toward a building at the end of the path. The building contained the facilities where they would die.
The initial killing facilities consisted of 3 chambers, each approximately 4 meters by 4 meters. False shower heads were installed in the ceiling to maintain the deception until the final moment. Each chamber could hold between 270 and 300 people, though the SS would often force even more inside, packing victims so tightly they could barely move. The method of killing employed at Treblinka differed from other extermination camps. Rather than using Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide used at Auschwitz, Treblinka utilized carbon monoxide from engine exhaust. A motor, likely a captured Soviet tank engine adapted for this purpose, was operated outside the building. Pipes channeled the deadly fumes into the chambers. There is some historical debate about the exact type of engine used. Many survivor testimonies mention a diesel engine, though diesel exhaust contains lower concentrations of carbon monoxide than gasoline engines. Some historians believe a wood gas generator engine may have been employed, as such devices were common in wartime Germany and produced highly toxic fumes. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result was the same. The process typically took between 30 and 40 minutes, during which those trapped inside died from asphyxiation and carbon monoxide poisoning. A Ukrainian guard, a Soviet prisoner of war named Ivan Marchenko, operated the engine. Survivors would later testify about this man, describing his cruelty and the efficiency with which he performed his task. After the war, questions about Marchenko's identity and fate would become the subject of intense investigation and controversy. Once the victims were dead, Jewish work details would open the chambers and begin the grim task of removing the bodies. Anyone still showing signs of life was killed immediately. The bodies were loaded onto railway carts and transported to burial pits, and later to cremation sites. By autumn 1942, the 3 original chambers were deemed insufficient for the scale of killing the Nazis intended. A new building was constructed, containing 10 larger chambers. This expansion increased Treblinka's capacity to murder between 2,000 and 2,500 people per day. With this enhanced infrastructure, the camp reached its peak efficiency as a killing facility. Initially, the bodies of victims were buried in mass graves near the camp. However, this method proved problematic. The graves were enormous, some containing tens of thousands of bodies. As decomposition progressed, the ground would swell and crack, releasing unbearable stenches that could be detected far beyond the camp perimeter. Liquid from decomposing bodies would seep into the surrounding soil. The Nazis realized this created evidence that would be difficult to conceal. In autumn 1942, particularly after the Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated that Germany might not win the war, Nazi leadership became increasingly concerned about covering their tracks. An order came down to exhume all previously buried bodies and destroy them completely. For this task, the SS brought in a specialist, Herbert Floss, an SS officer who appeared disarmingly young and pleasant, arrived at Treblinka in late 1942. Floss had experience in the Nazi euthanasia program and had developed expertise in disposing of human remains. Under his direction, the method of body disposal at Treblinka was transformed. Floss designed and oversaw the construction of massive outdoor cremation facilities. Concrete platforms were laid, upon which railway rails were placed. Metal grates were positioned on top of the rails, creating enormous grills. The bodies of victims would be stacked on these grates in layers, with wood soaked in gasoline placed underneath. The pyres would then be ignited. Floss instructed his subordinates in the grotesque science of efficient cremation. He explained that bodies burned at different rates, depending on age, gender, and body composition. Elderly and overweight victims burned more efficiently. Children's bodies burned less completely and required more fuel. By layering different types of bodies, the fires could be made more effective. This knowledge was immediately applied. The cremation fires of Treblinka burned day and night, visible for kilometers around, clouds of smoke and ash marking the location of mass murder. The work of exhuming and burning the previously buried victims continued throughout early 1943. Jewish prisoners forced to perform this labor would later testify about the horror of their task. They dug up decomposed remains, often unable to distinguish individual bodies. The smell was indescribable. The psychological trauma of handling the corpses of their own people, knowing they might be exhuming family members, was beyond measure.
Life within Treblinka, such as it was for those temporarily kept alive to perform labor, existed under conditions of absolute terror. The German staff and their auxiliaries maintained control through random violence, constant brutality, and the ever-present threat of death. Commandant Stengel was known for his habit of riding through the camp on a white horse, dressed immaculately, observing the operations with cold detachment. His deputy, Kurt, was openly sadistic, frequently intoxicated, and prone to random acts of violence. He carried a knife at all times and would not hesitate to kill prisoners for minor infractions or simply for his entertainment. Kurt's dog, Berry, became an instrument of terror in its own right. Trained to attack on command, the massive animal would be set upon prisoners, mauling or killing them. Some victims never reached the killing facilities at all. Sick, elderly, or infant arrivals who could not walk the path to the chambers would be taken directly to the cremation area, where guards, often drunk, would kill them by smashing their heads against logs or the ground. This saved bullets, which were considered too valuable to waste. To mask the sounds of death, the SS forced Jewish musicians among the prisoners to form an orchestra. This ensemble would play cheerful music near the arrival platform and during processing, drowning out screams and creating a surreal, nightmarish atmosphere. Survivors would later describe the psychological torture of hearing pleasant melodies mixed with the sounds of murder. The guards and staff of Treblinka engaged in constant theft and corruption. Personal belongings of victims, from jewelry to clothing to currency, were supposed to be catalogued and sent to Germany. In practice, much of it was stolen by camp personnel. According to testimony from survivor Jankiel Wiernik, the guards were perpetually drunk on stolen alcohol and would sell anything they could pilfer to acquire more. Sexual violence was routine. Guards would select attractive women from arriving transports, drag them to barracks, assault them, and then send them to the killing facilities. This violence was not hidden, but openly practiced, another element of the complete dehumanization that defined Treblinka. Between July 1942 and October 1943, approximately 800,000 people were murdered at Treblinka. The overwhelming majority were Jews, primarily from Poland, but also from other European nations. Transports arrived from the Warsaw Ghetto, Radom, Bialystok, and countless other communities. Jews from Greece, from Slovakia, from Germany itself, all were transported to this remote forest to be killed. Among the dead were approximately 2,000 Roma,
several thousand Polish political prisoners, and around 1,000 Soviet prisoners of war. But Jewish victims constituted more than 95% of those murdered. Entire communities were erased. Centuries-old Jewish populations from cities and towns across Poland were transported to Treblinka and annihilated within days. In terms of total victims, only Auschwitz exceeded Treblinka. However, Auschwitz was a vast complex that included labor camps and industrial facilities. Treblinka had one purpose. It was designed solely to kill, and it fulfilled that purpose with horrifying efficiency. People arrived, were processed, and were murdered, often within 3 hours of stepping off the train. On August 2, 1943, prisoners in Treblinka staged an uprising. The revolt had been planned for months by a small group of prisoners who recognized that everyone in the camp was ultimately doomed. The conspirators managed to smuggle weapons from the camp armory and coordinate an attack. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, the revolt began. Conspirators attacked guards, set buildings on fire, and attempted to destroy camp infrastructure. Chaos erupted as hundreds of prisoners attempted to escape. The SS and their auxiliaries responded with overwhelming force. Machine gun fire cut down prisoners as they ran. Special units were deployed to hunt down those who managed to reach the surrounding forests. The revolt was suppressed within hours. Of the approximately 700 prisoners in the camp, around 200 managed to escape beyond the perimeter. However, only a handful would ultimately survive. SS search teams and collaborators hunted escapees through the forests for days. Many were caught and killed. Some were betrayed by local residents. Others died from exposure or injuries sustained in the escape. However, approximately 50 prisoners did survive to the end of the war. Some found refuge with Polish partisan groups operating in the forests. Others were hidden by sympathetic local residents who risked their own lives to shelter them. These survivors would later provide crucial testimony about what had occurred at Treblinka.
By late 1943, with the military situation deteriorating and Soviet forces advancing westward, Nazi leadership ordered Treblinka to be dismantled. The camp had largely completed its purpose. Most of Poland's Jewish population had been murdered. The Warsaw Ghetto had been liquidated. The transports that had once arrived daily had slowed to a trickle. The SS began a systematic destruction of all evidence. Buildings were torn down. The killing facilities were demolished. Railway tracks were torn up and removed. The cremation grates were dismantled. Even the brick foundations of structures were broken apart and scattered. Trees were planted across the site. Ukrainian guards were brought in to plow the fields, attempting to turn the area into farmland that would conceal what had occurred there. By early 1944, Treblinka had been erased from the landscape. Where a camp complex had stood, only disturbed earth and scattered debris remained. The Nazis believed they had successfully concealed their crimes.
They were wrong. After the war, investigation teams began the process of documenting what had occurred at Treblinka. The testimony of survivors proved crucial. Despite the Nazis' efforts to eliminate evidence, mass graves were discovered and excavated. Personal belongings, documents, and physical remnants of the camp's infrastructure were uncovered. The trials that followed the war brought some perpetrators to justice, though many escaped punishment entirely. Commandant Stangl fled to Brazil after the war, living under an assumed name for nearly 2 decades. He was finally arrested in 1967, extradited to West Germany, and convicted of complicity in the murder of 900,000 people. He received a life sentence and died in prison in 1971. Kurt also initially escaped, but was eventually captured and prosecuted. Other members of the camp staff faced various judicial proceedings in multiple countries. However, many of the guards and perpetrators were never identified or prosecuted. Some lived out their lives in freedom, their crimes unpunished by earthly justice. Ivan Marchenko, the Ukrainian guard who operated the killing mechanism, became the subject of intense controversy decades after the war. In the 1980s, a man named John Demjanjuk was accused of being Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. He was tried in Israel, convicted and sentenced to death. However, evidence later emerged suggesting mistaken identity, and his conviction was overturned. The question of Marchenko's true identity remains unresolved to this day.
Today, the site of Treblinka is a memorial. Thousands of stones represent the communities destroyed in the camp. Larger monuments commemorate the victims. The peaceful forest gives little indication of the horror that occurred here. Treblinka represents one of the Holocaust's most efficient killing centers. It demonstrated the Nazi regime's commitment to the complete annihilation of European Jewry and the bureaucratic, industrial methods they employed to achieve that goal. Unlike concentration camps that combined labor exploitation with killing, Treblinka had no pretense of any purpose other than death. The story of Treblinka challenges us to understand how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. The camp staff were not all ideological fanatics. Many were career police officers, bureaucrats following orders, or ordinary men who accepted their assignments and performed them. This ordinariness makes the crimes more disturbing, not less. It reveals how systems can transform normal individuals into participants in genocide. For survivors and descendants of victims, Treblinka is a wound that never fully heals. Entire family lines were erased here. Children who should have grown up, had families and grown old, were instead murdered in infancy. Talented artists, scholars, craftspeople, and ordinary people were eliminated for no reason other than their identity.
In the history of human cruelty, Treblinka occupies a unique and terrible position. It was a place where the machinery of mass murder operated with cold efficiency, where hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed within months, where the bodies were burned to hide the evidence of genocide. The story of Treblinka is not merely about death. It is about the systematic dehumanization of victims, the corruption of perpetrators, and the failure of civilization to prevent atrocity. It is about what happens when hatred becomes policy, when prejudice becomes law, and when killing becomes routine. We remember Treblinka not out of morbid fascination, but out of moral necessity. We remember because forgetting would compound the crime. We remember because understanding how such horrors became possible is essential to preventing their recurrence. We remember because the victims deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as human beings who lived, loved, and died in a place designed solely for their destruction. The ashes of Treblinka were scattered across the Polish countryside, but memory cannot be scattered. It must be preserved, transmitted, and honored. In bearing witness to what occurred in those forests 80 years ago, we fulfill an obligation to the dead and to future generations. The history of the Second World War is filled with countless atrocities, but facilities like Treblinka represent the ultimate expression of genocidal intent. They were not collateral damage of war, not unfortunate byproducts of conflict, but deliberate, planned, and executed systems of mass murder. Understanding them is essential to understanding both the depths to which humanity can sink and the moral imperative to ensure such darkness never returns. This has been the story of Treblinka. Never forget, never again. Subscribe to the channel to hear more untold history facts that no one talks about.